A magistrate and his deputy are there to maintain law and order. But what happens when the magistrate can't see past his own nose and the deputy is a useless drunk? Well, hello everybody. Hope you're well. It's a lovely day here in the UK, and I hope everyone is having a wonderful weekend. So, for this video, I thought I would go into some detail about law and order in the town where my book is set. And I want to focus for a short while on the magistrate and his deputy. Now, I suppose when people think of deputies, they kind of think of deputies in Western, sheriffs, and that kind of thing. And it's not too far from that. But because my world is draws most of its inspiration from medieval Europe, it's very much akin to sort of dropping them into that kind of setting. And it revolves around the judiciary and maintaining the peace. And two central characters and their relationship is very much key, and a very important sort of running plot throughout the first book and potentially beyond. So on the one hand, it's a relationship of contrast because on the one hand we have a magistrate, Emmett Krell. I have posted a few little hints about him to my Instagram and other social media in the past. Emmett Krell is quite a complicated character, an older man. He was posted to Varicel, the town where the book is set, from the capital city about 10 years before our hero Fenn arrives. And Emmett is a stickler for law and order. He's a great believer in justice, that justice will always prevail. And he's entirely, or at least he likes to think, he's entirely driven by evidence, which of course is what all good magistrates should be. He works hand in hand with the rest of the law enforcement in that town, and his posting to Varicel was seen by him very much as a kind of semi-punishment in a sense. He never quite understood why he was shipped to the south into some dreary little backwater like Varicel. But he's made the most of it, and he's established himself as a person who is to be respected begrudgingly, feared a little, but ultimately someone that most people recognise tries his best to keep the peace and be fair-minded in his approach to things. He actually took over from another man in the town called Garrett Webb, and he had to retire from the job. And that was partly why the town requested a replacement for various reasons. Emmett has never been particularly keen on being placed there, but he's made the best of the bad situation. And he took it upon himself not long after he arrived to attempt to mentor and train up a deputy. Because, all good magistrates need a sort of lieutenant, a second in command, to help them carry out enforce law and order. And so we come to the other side of the coin, which is our hapless deputy, Tallisen Ward. Tallisen is, for all intents and purposes, a useless drunk. He spends most of his time in the tavern, cozying up to the tavern owner, Eleanor. He gives his job the absolute minimal effort required to carry out his duties so that he doesn't get sacked, or worse, jailed. And he is constantly battling with his master, with Emmett, as to how to do a good job, whether or not they're doing the right thing. And Emmett very much struggles with this person who he feels he's invested an immense amount of time and energy into, and ultimately they've just thrown it back in his face over the last few years. He's at the point of a precipice of just simply giving up on the man and saying, well, look, he couldn't really investigate his way out of a shoebox, to be quite honest, let alone investigate a murder, which of course is what takes place in the book, which Fenn gets himself embroiled in. So when the pair of them are presented with the challenge of a person is killed in the town, and the suspect is a darkling, Fenn, and his supposed new friend Hessa. Emmett's very much, look, we need to be led by the evidence. You need to obtain proof. You need to go and speak to people, interrogate the prisoner, interview the town, find out who witnessed it, find out what happened, retrace everybody's steps. And of course, Tallisen is pretty much useless at most of those things. He can throw a punch when his opponent is shackled to a chair in a jail cell, but little else beyond that. And to make matters worse, Tallisen's loyalties are stretched to the absolute limits in this book. He is someone who lurches between, deep down, in a sense, wanting to do a good job, but not being quite able to bring himself to do that. He has the desire, but not necessarily the discipline. And I think that's where so many people often fall over in real life, where they know they want to achieve something. They just can't quite bring themselves to achieve it. And sometimes it's because things get in the way. Sometimes there are things beyond their control, in which case you try not to sweat things that are outside of your control, that you can't do anything about. But very often, it's more a case of those obstacles we've placed them in front of ourselves. We've created them ourselves as excuses, as ways of making things easier and more bearable, as ways of convincing ourselves that we're doing the right thing by choosing not to achieve something or choosing not to take a risk. And ultimately, sometimes because we're driven out of fear. And Tallisen is a really good example of someone who is a slave to his emotions. He loves people and he fears others. And it's that love and fear which act as a kind of tug of war, and he's the person in the middle, sort of being pulled apart by them. Emmett, on the one side, is very much this disciplinarian, someone who sees Tallisen as a bit of a failure, as a pathetic man, someone who he barely trusts. But at the end of the day, the situation becomes so grim that he feels he has no alternative but to trust that Tallisen's going to do the right thing by his job. And, the odd little threat here and there as to whether or not Tallisen may join Fenn next to him in the gallows tends to motivate people, as you might imagine. On the other hand, he wants to help protect people in town who he cares about. He wants to get to the bottom of the truth. He wants to get to the bottom of what happened, but he doesn't quite know how to get there. Not without betraying people, not without hurting them, possibly not without betraying himself. For all of the time that he spends in the tavern, drinking mead and downing ale and plenty of other stronger stuff, which he secretes away in his office, there is a good, if imperfect, man beneath that facade. And I enjoyed writing someone who really struggles to understand who they are, what their place in the world is, and someone who has been given a modicum of power and responsibility but doesn't have the first clue about what to do with it. And I really sort of enjoyed throwing that in front of Emmett Krell, who is this upstanding, mature, very wise, very very strong-willed individual who expects a lot from Tallisen and invariably doesn't get it. And that clash is very evident in the book. They clash often, very angry exchanges. Tallisen hates Emmett. Emmett has complete and utter disdain for Tallisen. Yet they do need each other. Tallisen needs direction. He needs somebody to tell him that he's doing a good job, in a sense, try and paper over the cracks of his insecurities and help justify his actions. So I think on some level he's desperate for acceptance, but he can't quite seem to do the work to justify that acceptance. He can't quite meet those criteria. And potentially Emmett is very strict, very very unfair to Tallisen. He's his deputy, so he expects a lot of him. But more often than not, he expects him to fail. And I think Tallisen, it leeches some of that from Emmett. And at times, when invariably he does fail, it's kind of, well, we both knew this was going to happen, didn't we? So he gets himself into quite a rut, the poor old deputy. And it just so happens that the most unlikely of places, the most unlikely of people, help him to start clamber out of that. And so I very much enjoyed Tallisen being at the centre of a little tussle of morality, a tussle of emotions, a fight to do his job properly, prove someone's guilt or otherwise. And I use the word guilt deliberately because pretty much everyone in the town is convinced that Fenn is guilty. Emmett, by contrast, is very much someone who is, we need to gather the evidence. We need to be careful about how we approach this situation. Presumed innocence is far more of a grey area in the world of the books that I've written than you might imagine in a developed Western civilization, for example. Certainly taking inspiration from medieval times, justice was often cruel, swift, uncompromising, and you could probably ascribe those kinds of things to Emmett. Tallisen, by contrast, is soft, malleable, easy to manipulate, emotional, and likes a drink. That's a bit of a cocktail of disaster, if you'll forgive the pun. And Eleanor, who's the tavern owner, who on some level loves Tallisen, knows it. And as someone who is very good at manipulating people, he is putty in her hands. So poor old Tallisen gets thrown around quite a lot in the book. And it's not really particularly a spoiler to suggest that it's hopefully not the last we're going to see of Tallisen, because he's such a good character who's ripe for redemption, who's ripe for learning and growing and evolving and making plenty more mistakes, but in doing so gains something from it. And Krell, on the other hand, is stuck in his ways and fed up of everyone around him, very cynical, and kind of thinks to himself, well, pretty much everyone is useless apart from me. And I can't quite remember where I got the inspiration for his character from. Possibly me. Anyway, so that's a dynamic that I wanted to tell you about. And very much something that Fenn even struggles with throughout the book, because it's kind of like, well, hang on a second. You're telling me you want me to admit that I'm guilty. You want to potentially try me, convict me, and all these other things. You talk about evidence, but on the other hand, you're putting this person in charge of finding me and bringing me in. This useless drunk. I mean, it just adds to Fenn's anxieties because he feels like the due process isn't fair, isn't balanced. And has too many compromises. So lots of tension created between sort of 3 or 4 people. And part of the joy of writing all of that was learning how to link them all together. That's also part of the complexity of writing, of course, because when the developmental edit of the book came back, I got myself tied up in knots a little bit because the chap who'd very kindly done this edit for me was like, well, why is he saying this when 3 chapters ago he said this? Why is she reacting like this when he's already done this? And I thought at one point, oh God, it's all gone horribly wrong. But I managed to recover from it. I had to take a step back. I had to work out the course that each person takes as the book progresses, and that's just part of the edit. That's a single pass of the book, is to work out, where does Tallisen start? Where does he end? Where does Krell start? Where does he end? How does Eleanor interject between all of those things? How does Fen interact with them and connect with them in some way so that it gets a satisfying resolution? And, I think in time I will come to see even that after 10 edits of the book now, that it is still imperfect. But it's also me. And it's just what I wrote. And that's what writing's all about. Entertaining imperfection. That might be the byline, actually, of my first novel. No. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed listening to this. Hope it's given you a bit more insight. And please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you on the next video.